On the 7th of October 1975, I was plastering a patient's arm when an assistant nurse burst through the door and announced that a plane had crashed and the wounded were coming in by helicopter. It was my 5th day as a junior doctor on the emergency ward in the small coastal town of Hudiksvall in Sweden. All the senior staff were down in the dining hall, and I could already hear the helicopter landing. The nurse and I were going to have to handle this on our own. Seconds later, a stretcher was rolled in bearing a man in dark green overalls and a camouflage life jacket. His arms and legs were twitching. An epileptic seizure, I thought. Off with his clothes. I removed his life jacket easily, but his overalls looked like a spacesuit with huge sturdy zippers all over, and I couldn't find a zipper that undid them. I had just registered that the uniform meant this was a military pilot when I noticed the blood all over the floor. "He's bleeding!" I shouted. I grabbed a big pair of plaster pliers to cut through the fabric and howled to the assistant nurse, "4 bags of blood, O negative, now!" To the patient I shouted, "Where does it hurt?" He replied. I couldn't understand a word, but it sounded like Russian. Then I realized this must be a Russian fighter pilot who's been shot down over Swedish territory, which means that the Soviet Union is attacking us. World War III has started. I was paralyzed by fear. At that moment, the head nurse, Birgitta, came back from lunch. She snatched the plaster pliers from my hand and hissed, "Don't shred it. It's an Air Force G-suit, and it costs more than 10,000 Swedish krona." After a beat, she added, "And can you please step off the life jacket? You're standing on the color cartridge and it's making the whole floor red." Birgitta turned to the patient, calmly freed him from his G-suit and wrapped him in a couple of blankets. "You were in the icy water for 23 minutes, she told him in Swedish, "which is why you're jerking and shivering and why we can't understand what you're saying." The Swedish Air Force pilot, who had evidently crashed during a routine flight, gave me a comforting little smile. For me, the experience is hard to forget. I will forever remember my complete misjudgment. Everything was the other way round. The Russian was Swedish, the war was peace, the epileptic seizure was cooling, and the blood was a colour ampule from inside the life jacket. Yet it had all seemed so convincing to me. When we are afraid, we do not see clearly. There's no room for facts when our minds are occupied by fear. An uncountable number of events happened in the world today. A tiny fraction will be reported in the media. A fraction of those will reach you and contribute to your picture of the world. The question is, what parts are we processing and what parts are we ignoring? The kind of information we seem most likely to process is stories. Information that sounds dramatic. So we end up paying attention to information that fits our dramatic instincts and ignoring information that does not. But the unusual stories we're constantly shown by the media paint dramatic pictures in our heads. If we're not careful, we come to think that this is what the world looks like. Yet here's the paradox. The image of a dangerous world has never been broadcast more effectively than it is now, while the world has never been less violent and more safe. In 2015, Nepal was hit by an earthquake. The death rate is always higher when a disaster hits a country on level 1 because of poorly constructed buildings, poor infrastructure, and poor medical facilities. 9,000 people died. So here's a question. How did the number of deaths per year from natural disasters change over the last 100 years? Did it more than double, stay the same, or decrease to less than half? In my survey, just 9% of people picked the right answer. In fact, the number of deaths from acts of nature has dropped far below half. It's now just 20% of what it was 100 years ago. The reason natural disasters kill so many fewer people today is not because nature has changed. It's because the majority of people no longer live in extreme poverty on level 1. With more money comes better preparedness. Back in 1942, Bangladesh was on level 1 and almost all its citizens were illiterate farmers. Over a 2-year period, it suffered terrible floods, droughts, and cyclones. No international organization came to the rescue, and 2 million people died. Today, Bangladesh is on level 2. Today, almost all Bangladeshi children finish school, where they learned that 3 red and black flags means everyone must run to the evacuation centers. The government has installed across the country's huge river delta a digital surveillance system connected to a flood monitoring website. Just 15 years ago, no country in the world had such an advanced system. So when the cyclone hit in 2015, the plan worked, and the World Food Programme flew in 113 tons of supplies to the 30,000 evacuated families. In the same year, 2015, vivid images spread across the world of the horrific earthquake in Nepal, and rescue teams and helicopters were quickly deployed. Tragically, thousands were already dead. But the humanitarian resources that rushed to this inaccessible country on level 1 did manage to prevent the death toll from rising even further. The UN's Relief Web has become a global coordinator for disaster help, and it's paid for by taxpayers on level 4. We should be very proud of it. We have finally figured out how to protect ourselves against nature. Unfortunately, the people on level 4 paying for the Relief Web are the same people we asked about the trend in natural disasters. 91% of them are unaware of the success they are paying for, because their journalists continue to report every disaster as if it was the worst. So, the next time the news shows you horrific images of victims trapped under collapsed buildings, will you be able to remember the positive long-term trend? I don't think so. Not if you function like me. Because when the camera pans to bodies of dead children being pulled out of the debris, my intellectual capacity is blocked by fear and sorrow. Claiming in that moment that things are getting better would be to trivialize the immense suffering of those victims and their families. But when the danger is over, we must dare to establish a fact-based worldview again. We must compare the numbers to make sure our resources are used effectively to stop future suffering. For 10 days or so in 2015, the world was watching the images from Nepal where 9,000 people had died. During the same 10 days, diarrhea from contaminated drinking water killed 8,400 children across the world. But there were no camera teams around as these children fainted in the arms of their crying parents. No helicopters swooped in. Helicopters, anyway, don't work against this child killer. All that's needed to stop a child from accidentally drinking her neighbor's lukewarm poo is a few plastic pipes, a water pump, some soap, and a sewage system. Much cheaper than a helicopter. In the 1940s, a new wonder chemical was discovered that killed most insects. Farmers were happy. People fighting malaria were happy. DDT was sprayed over crops, across swamps, and in homes with little investigation of its side effects. Its creator won a Nobel Prize. During the 1950s, the early environmental movement in the USA started to raise concerns about levels of DDT accumulating in the food chain, into fish, and even into birds. A fear of insufficient regulation and irresponsible companies was ignited, and the global environmental movement was born. Thanks to this movement, the world today has decent chemical and safety regulations covering many countries. DDT was banned in several countries, and aid agencies had to stop using it. But, as a side effect, we've been left with a level of public fear of chemical contamination that almost resembles paranoia. It's called chemophobia. This means that a fact-based understanding of topics like childhood vaccinations, nuclear power, or DDT is still extremely difficult today. But I will try anyway. In a devastating example of critical thinking gone bad, highly educated, deeply caring parents avoid the vaccinations that would protect their children from killer diseases. I admire skepticism, but only within a framework that respects the evidence. So, if you are skeptical about the measles vaccination, I ask you to do two things. First, make sure you know what it looks like when a child dies from measles. There is still no cure, and even with the best modern medicine, 1 or 2 children in every 1,000 will die of it. Second, ask yourself, what kind of evidence would convince me to change my mind? If the answer is no evidence could ever change my mind about vaccination, then you are putting yourself outside of evidence-based rationality, outside of the very critical thinking that first brought you to this point. To be consistent in your skepticism about science, next time you have an operation, you should tell your surgeon not to bother washing her hands. The victims here, and almost the only people in the world now dying of measles, are the unvaccinated children. Measles has now been almost eradicated from countries on level 1, but it remains a killer in the United States. DDT should be used with great caution, but there are pros and cons. In refugee camps teeming with mosquitoes, for example, DDT is often one of the quickest and cheapest ways to save lives. Americans, Europeans, and fear-driven lobbyists, though, are not ready to discuss its use, which means some aid organizations avoid this evidence-based solution that would save lives. Fear can be useful, but only if it is directed at the right things. To understand what we should truly be scared of, we should suppress our fear instinct and measure the actual death tolls. Because frightening and dangerous are two different things. Something frightening poses a perceived risk. Something dangerous poses a real risk. Paying too much attention to what is frightening rather than what is dangerous creates a drainage of energy in the wrong directions. It makes a terrified junior doctor think about nuclear war when he should be treating hypothermia. And it makes whole populations focus on earthquakes and invisible substances when millions are dying from diarrhea and seafloors are becoming underwater deserts.